5:47 a.m., June 3rd, 2026. Kearny Mesa, San Diego, California. 140 federal agents moved simultaneously towards 16 separate addresses across 2 business parks. Estimated value of diverted military components, $93 million. The targets weren't warehouses. They weren't shipping docks. They were office suites, carpeted floors, ergonomic chairs. Conference rooms with whiteboards covered in compliance checklists. Every single one held a valid State Department registration. Everyone had passed ITAR audits. Several had active Department of Defense contractor relationships going back more than a decade. On paper, they were among the most credentialed defense export consultancies on the West Coast. What they actually were, a precision-engineered diversion network that had spent 17 months routing controlled dual-use military components through the United Arab Emirates and into the hands of buyers in Iran, and in 3 documented cases, into the hands of procurement agents with direct links to the People's Republic of China. The front doors opened at exactly the same moment across all 16 locations. The investigation had started not in San Diego, not even in California. It started in a Pentagon audit room in Arlington, Virginia, in January 2026, when a single line item in a $14 billion Taiwan arms package didn't match. That mismatch took 5 months to fully understand. What agents eventually uncovered wasn't a rogue exporter cutting corners. It was a deliberate, architecturally sophisticated network built to exploit a specific gap in the federal arms transfer system, timed to activate during a window of bureaucratic disruption that its architects had anticipated years in advance. One detail that stuck. The network hadn't panicked when the Taiwan arms pause was announced. It had prepared for it. Hold that thought. Because understanding how this was constructed, and how it nearly remained invisible, requires going back to how the network was built in the first place. The 16 companies shared almost nothing on the surface. Different names, different principals, different registered agents, different DUNS numbers and cage codes. Several were incorporated in different states: Nevada, Delaware, Wyoming, with only their operational offices clustered in San Diego's Kearny Mesa and Sorrento Valley corridors. Lease records showed staggered move-in dates going back as far as 2019. 3 of the 16 had been operating for less than 2 years. Each held a valid registration with the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Each had maintained clean ITAR compliance histories. No violations, no flags, no enforcement actions. Several had participated in voluntary self-disclosure processes, which in the federal export control world functions almost like a loyalty signal. Companies that proactively report minor infractions are treated as good actors. The network had used that mechanism deliberately, filing a combined 14 voluntary disclosures across its member companies over 4 years. All minor, all paperwork infractions, all resolved without penalty. The result was a portfolio of institutional credibility that would have taken legitimate exporters years to build. Their stated business model was straightforward and genuinely common in the defense sector: consulting on the legal transfer of commercial dual-use components to allied nations. Items like ruggedized electronics, precision inertial guidance subassemblies, thermal imaging modules, and encrypted communication hardware. Components that exist in both civilian and military configurations and require careful licensing because the same unit that navigates a civilian drone can navigate a military one. San Diego's defense corridor is one of the most concentrated clusters of this kind of work in the country. The 16 companies did not stand out. They were designed not to. The scheme's architecture relied on a transshipment layer in Dubai. Each of the 16 companies maintained commercial relationships with 1 or more UAE-registered trading firms, nominally independent, in practice coordinated. When a component order was placed for an approved end user, a parallel order for identical specifications was quietly routed through the UAE entity, redocumented with altered end user certificates, and forwarded to buyers in Iran. The substitution was clean enough that the physical components were indistinguishable from legitimate transfers. The documentation trails diverged only at the commercial invoice level, a divergence that required cross-referencing Bureau of Industry and Security export filings with Treasury's OFAC screening records, a process that didn't happen automatically. The companies themselves were staffed like real consultancies. Administrative assistants who scheduled meetings with defense procurement offices. Compliance officers who attended ITAR certification seminars and posted the certificates on their office walls. One company had sponsored a scholarship at a local university's international trade law program for 3 consecutive years. The principals attended industry conferences. They sat on panels. 2 of the 16 had been cited in trade publications as examples of best practice export compliance management. The network didn't just look legitimate. It actively participated in the infrastructure of legitimacy, visibly, consistently, over years. In January 2026, the acting Navy Secretary placed a temporary administrative hold on a $14 billion arms package destined for Taiwan. The hold was procedural, tied to the broader Iran conflict context, concerns about operational security in the Strait, and a pending National Security Council review. It was not a scandal. It was a bureaucratic pause. Inside the Pentagon Inspector General's Audit Division, it generated a specific kind of administrative headache. Approximately 230 individual component-level transfer approvals that had been queued for processing were now in limbo. Auditors were tasked with reconciling the paused approvals against active export filings to ensure nothing moved without clearance. That reconciliation produced an anomaly. Across a 4-week window following the Taiwan pause announcement, the audit team identified 27 commercial export filings, submitted by companies in the San Diego network, that contained component specifications either identical to or within negligible tolerance of items in the frozen Taiwan package. The specifications weren't publicly available. They weren't the kind of item descriptions that would appear in a commercial catalog. To match them at that level of precision, a filer would have needed access to the Taiwan package's internal component manifest. The audit flag was classified and forwarded to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and the ATF's Import-Export Enforcement Unit the same week. Most people assume federal investigations of this type start with a tip, an informant, someone inside the network who gets nervous and makes a call. The evidence in this case tells a different story. It started with a spreadsheet comparison, a line item audit, a number that didn't match a different number. Special Agent Daria Falk was assigned to the parallel criminal file. Falk was detailed to the Bureau of Industry and Security's Export Enforcement Unit, a joint assignment that put her at the intersection of ATF's Criminal Investigative Authority and BIS's administrative jurisdiction over export controls. She had spent 7 years working dual-use export cases. She recognized the substitution signature immediately. What she saw in the Pentagon audit data wasn't a coincidence. It was a timing pattern. The substitution filings had appeared not randomly, but in a compressed window, within days of the Taiwan hold announcement. That meant someone had been monitoring the administrative process closely enough to respond to a pause announcement before it was publicly confirmed. The Taiwan hold had been announced internally on a Wednesday. The first substitution filing had been submitted the following Friday. Falk pulled the DDTC registration records for all 27 filing entities. 16 were clustered in 2 San Diego business parks. That cluster was the investigation's first structural boundary. The criminal file was opened on February 4th, 2026. What no one expected, what took the first 3 weeks of the investigation to confirm, was that the network's substitution mechanism hadn't been improvised in response to the Taiwan pause. It had been designed for it. The administrative chaos surrounding a major arms hold wasn't something the network had opportunistically exploited. It had been anticipating exactly this kind of disruption window for at least 2 years. Going through the BIS export filing records, one pattern kept recurring. The 16 companies had never significantly overlapped in their legitimate filing activity. They operated in parallel. Different products, different end users, different allied nation recipients. On paper, they weren't affiliated, but their substitution filings, the fraudulent ones, were all routed through the same 4 UAE trading entities. The coordination was visible only when you overlaid the fraudulent layer against the legitimate one. 4 weeks into the investigation, Falk's team had mapped the UAE transshipment structure. 8 of the 16 San Diego companies connected to 2 primary Dubai entities, a trading firm registered in Jebel Ali Free Zone and a second entity registered in Abu Dhabi's Kizad Industrial Park. The other 8 connected to 2 secondary Dubai firms with less transaction volume. All 4 UAE entities had been registered within an 18-month window between 2022 and 2023. None had more than 3 employees of record. All had significant turnover in registered directors. DCSA, the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, was brought into the investigation in late February. Their contribution was critical. They had existing surveillance infrastructure on one of the UAE entities through a separate, unrelated counterintelligence investigation into procurement networks with PRC connections. The overlap confirmed what the financial records had suggested. 3 of the 16 San Diego companies had routing that didn't terminate in Iran. It terminated further east. The case had started as an ITAR arms diversion investigation. It had become something larger. The central question had shifted. It was no longer just, who was running the network? It was, who inside the Taiwan arms package review process had provided the component specifications? That question would take another 6 weeks to answer. The investigation had a second thread running in parallel, and it led somewhere no one had initially expected. Here's what this tells us about the current state of export control enforcement. The system works, but it works slowly. The compliance architecture around dual-use military components is layered. DDTC, BIS, OFAC, IG audits, DCSA screening. And each layer catches different things. The Taiwan pause had created a seam between those layers, a temporary gap in cross-referencing that the network had precisely timed its activity to exploit. The fact that the system caught it was due in part to the audit process working as designed, but it caught it after 17 months of active diversion. $93 million had already moved. The surveillance phase of the investigation ran from late February through mid-May 2026. Falk's team established static observation posts at 5 of the 16 target addresses in Kearny Mesa. The posts were built into the surrounding commercial environment. Investigators working cover as employees of adjacent businesses, a leased second-floor office in a building across from the largest target address, 2 vehicles with long-term permits in shared parking structures. Surveillance rotated on 12-hour shifts. In 3 months of observation, agents logged more than 1,400 individual entries and exits across the 5 monitored locations. The volume of foot traffic was consistent with functioning commercial enterprises. Delivery drivers, couriers, FedEx pickups, clients arriving for scheduled meetings with binders and laptops. Everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Electronic surveillance warrants covered the primary communications infrastructure of 6 of the companies. A separate FISA authorization covered the UAE transshipment entities and their domestic contact points. 3 obstacles nearly compromised the operation's timeline. The first, in early March, one of the target companies filed a voluntary self-disclosure with DDTC covering a minor documentation error in a legitimate transfer. The filing was routine, exactly the kind of compliance signal the network had been using to maintain its clean record. But it triggered an automatic review of the company's full filing history, which put BIS compliance officers in contact with company personnel at a moment when Falk's team wasn't positioned to monitor the exchange. The investigation's existence wasn't revealed, but for 72 hours, the team operated under the assumption that the company's principals might have been tipped to elevated regulatory scrutiny. Surveillance was pulled back to reduce exposure. A decision was made to accelerate the timeline for the secondary thread, the internal leak investigation, to prevent the window from closing. The internal leak investigation had identified 2 persons of interest by mid-March. Both were civilian contractors working in the Navy's acquisition division, specifically assigned to the Taiwan package review process. Both had access to the component manifest that had been replicated in the fraudulent filings. Neither had obvious financial connections to the San Diego network. The financial connection, when it was found, ran through a third party, a defense consulting firm in McLean, Virginia, with no apparent San Diego affiliation. The McLean firm had paid the 2 contractors a combined $1.4 million in consulting fees over 18 months, routed through what were nominally described as technical advisory contracts. The McLean firm's principals were the network's information brokers, individuals who maintained relationships inside DoD acquisition processes and converted access to procurement intelligence into commercial value for the San Diego operation. Would you have spotted this from the outside? A legitimate-looking consulting firm, clean contractor relationships, advisory fees that, individually, weren't large enough to trigger IRS reporting thresholds. The mechanism was designed to be invisible to any single oversight system. It required simultaneous visibility across tax records, DDTC filings, defense contractor payment databases, and counterintelligence surveillance to see it as a unified structure. In the 3rd week of March, investigators conducted the first of 3 non-custodial interviews with peripheral figures connected to the network. A former employee of one of the San Diego companies, a compliance analyst who had left the firm in late 2024 after less than a year, was contacted through a mutual attorney. She had no knowledge of the fraudulent activity. She had been hired to process legitimate transfer documentation and had done exactly that. But her account of the internal structure was detailed and consistent with what investigators had already mapped through financial records. She described a strict compartmentalization within the office. The compliance team, her team, worked on one side of the building. A separate, smaller group occupied a suite of offices accessible only through a secondary badge entry. She had never been inside. She had been told it was a specialized licensing team that handled sensitive end-user documentation. She had accepted that explanation and not thought more about it. When she left the firm, she had signed a standard non-disclosure agreement. She had kept it. She had never spoken about her work there to anyone. When investigators laid out the broad contours of what the other suite had actually been doing, she sat quietly for a long moment before responding. Her first question: were the components she had processed, the legitimate ones, going to be used to prosecute her? They were not. Her second question was whether she needed a lawyer. She did. By the end of March, the investigation had mapped the complete operational chain: the McLean information brokers, the 16 San Diego export entities, the 4 UAE transshipment firms, and the Iranian end buyers. The PRC connected procurement routing added a counterintelligence dimension that elevated the case to NSC visibility. The raid was initially scheduled for May 19th. It was delayed. The second obstacle: on May 16th, surveillance intercepts flagged an unscheduled communication between one of the San Diego principals and a contact number in Dubai that had not previously appeared in the investigation's mapped network. The communication was brief. The content was not recoverable in real time. The possibility that the network had detected surveillance, or received a warning from the McLean brokers, forced a 72-hour hold on all operational planning. An emergency case review was convened. Falk's team, FBI supervisory agents, ATF leadership, and DCSA counterintelligence officers spent 18 hours evaluating whether the investigation's integrity had been compromised. The assessment: the communication was likely operational rather than a warning signal, consistent with a routine coordination call for a scheduled shipment. The investigation had not been burned, but the timeline had to move. The raid was rescheduled for June 3rd. A third complication emerged 48 hours before execution. Background surveillance at San Diego International Airport identified 2 of the network's principals, identified in court documents as the primary operational coordinators for 4 of the 16 companies, at the international terminal reviewing flight itineraries. Both held UAE-issued travel documents in addition to their U.S. passports. A third individual, identified as the network's financial controller, was located at a hotel near the airport. The departure risk was assessed as high. A decision was made to move the airport arrest team into position 24 hours early. The 3 individuals were placed under continuous physical surveillance from the evening of June 2nd. 4 agents in plain clothes maintained rotating contact coverage across the terminal, the hotel lobby, and the hotel's restaurant and bar areas. A 5th agent was positioned at the International Departure Screening Checkpoint under federal officer identification. The 3 individuals ate dinner together in the hotel restaurant at approximately 9:15 p.m. on June 2nd. They appeared relaxed, unremarkable. 2 of them ordered wine. They reviewed documents that agents were not positioned to see clearly. By 11 p.m., all 3 had checked into their rooms. Think about what Falk was sitting with that night. A 17-month investigation, 16 target locations, 140 agents staged for simultaneous execution, and 2 of the primary targets at an airport looking at flights to Dubai. If one of them boards before 5:47 a.m., the entire operational architecture changes. Every hour of surveillance, every financial record, every wiretap authorization, all of it built toward a simultaneous multi-location raid that requires everyone in place at once. The night of June 2nd was not a comfortable night. At 4:30 a.m. on June 3rd, the 3 individuals at the airport were confirmed to still be in the terminal hotel. All 16 target locations had been surveilled overnight. No anomalous movement, no indication of early departure. At 5:31 a.m., raid teams at all 16 locations received final go confirmation. At 5:47 a.m., every door opened at once. The tactical execution at the Kearny Mesa locations was handled by ATF special response teams supplemented by FBI tactical agents. The Sorrento Valley locations were covered by a second ATF team with DCSA observers present for document triage. Entry at all 16 locations was simultaneous within a 4-second window. Inside the offices, servers, workstations, filing cabinets. Agents had floor plans, prepared from commercial real estate records, supplemented by HVAC contractor visits that had provided interior access in the weeks prior. Every room was mapped. Teams knew where the server infrastructure was before they entered. The first thing agents noted at nearly every location was how ordinary the spaces looked in the early morning light. Ergonomic chairs pushed neatly under desks. Whiteboards with last week's meeting notes still legible. One office had a coffee maker with a timer. It had already started brewing before agents made entry. A framed company mission statement on the wall at one of the Sorrento Valley offices described the firm's commitment to responsible defense technology transfer and the protection of allied nation security interests. The agents who photographed it as evidence did not photograph the caption. The caption wasn't necessary. At the primary Kearny Mesa address, a 3-story office building housing 3 of the 16 companies across separate suites, agents encountered one complication: a locked server room with a secondary electromagnetic security door that hadn't appeared in the floor plans. The building's maintenance logs had shown a recent installation by a commercial security contractor, but the timing hadn't triggered a planning update. An ATF technical specialist was on site. The door was opened in 11 minutes. Inside, 6 additional server units, a portable drive array, and $800,000 in wire transfer receipts printed and banded. Across all 16 locations, the recovery operation took 4 hours and 22 minutes. 34 server drives were seized, $12 million in structured wire transfer documentation, 3 complete sets of UAE trading entity correspondence, printed and physical, maintained as backup against digital forensics, a practice that ultimately provided some of the prosecution's cleanest evidence. A communication chain that explicitly referenced the Taiwan arms pause as a diversion window. The phrase used in one email, recovered from a drive at the 3rd Kearny Mesa location. The pause creates 2 to 3 months of clean air. Evidence processing teams worked through the afternoon and into the following day. The volume of physical documentation was significant enough that a secondary staging facility had been prearranged. A leased commercial space 3 miles from the primary Kearny Mesa target, large enough to accommodate the document triage operation. Agents laid out printed records across folding tables, organized by company and date range. Digital forensics teams cloned drives on site before transport. By the evening of June 3rd, the preliminary review had already identified 3 categories of evidence that prosecutors later described as unusually direct. The printed UAE correspondence, a spreadsheet cross-referencing legitimate transfer approvals against fraudulent substitution filings with date columns that matched the Taiwan pause window precisely, and a draft communication. Never sent, recovered from a deleted folder. That appeared to be a contingency message to the UAE side coordinator, addressed for use in the event the investigation was detected, before the operation could be wound down. The 3 principals at San Diego International were arrested at 6:02 a.m., 15 minutes after the first breach. They were at a departure gate for an Emirates Airlines flight to Dubai when federal agents made contact. No resistance, no attempt to flee. One of the 3 asked to speak to an attorney. The other 2 said nothing. The McLean, Virginia, arrests. 2 civilian contractors and 2 principals of the consulting firm were executed simultaneously by a separate FBI team. All 4 were taken into custody without incident. Here's the take that'll probably generate some pushback. The voluntary self-disclosure system that the network had been exploiting for 4 years deserves scrutiny. 14 voluntary disclosures filed across 16 companies, all minor, all resolved. That compliance theater wasn't just cover. It was evidence that the network understood the regulatory system well enough to game it. The compliance framework rewarded self-disclosure as a signal of good faith. The network converted that reward into institutional credibility. The system wasn't broken, but it had a blind spot, and sophisticated actors found it. The question that the BIS Compliance Division has been sitting with since June 3rd. If the network had never filed those disclosures, would the audit trail have been cleaner and harder to use? Or would the absence of any compliance history have been its own flag? There's no clean answer. Charging documents were filed in the Southern District of California on June 10th. 23 individuals were named. The charges included conspiracy to violate the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, conspiracy to violate the Export Administration Regulations, conspiracy to evade OFAC sanctions, and, for the 3 PRC routed transfers, conspiracy to provide material support to a foreign intelligence service. The principals of the McLean consulting firm faced additional charges: unauthorized transmission of defense information and wire fraud. If convicted on all counts, each faces a potential sentence of over 40 years. Was this a failure of the compliance system, or proof that the system ultimately worked? The network ran for 17 months. $93 million in controlled components reached sanctioned buyers. But the investigation did close. The network was mapped completely, or close to it. Close to it. Investigators have publicly confirmed that the 4 UAE transshipment entities have been fully documented. What has not been confirmed: the complete identity of end users beyond the primary Iranian buyers. The component manifest from the Taiwan package was replicated in 27 fraudulent filings. Investigators have accounted for the destination of 24 of them. 3 remain under active investigation. The components associated with those 3 filings have not been located. The McLean consulting firm's client list, beyond its relationship to the San Diego network, is also still under review. The firm had operated for 6 years before June 3rd. Its payment records show consulting fee arrangements with entities beyond those named in the charging documents. Whether those arrangements represent separate intelligence brokering relationships or legitimate advisory work is, as of the filing date of the indictment, still being assessed. There's a line in the indictment that reads almost like fiction. It notes that the network had specifically built its operational timeline around the expectation of a Taiwan arms pause consistent with historical patterns of arms transfer, disruption during elevated regional tensions. The architects hadn't just anticipated the pause, they had modeled it. One of the 23 named defendants remains at large, an individual identified as the network's primary UAE side coordinator, a non-U.S. person operating out of Dubai, was not present at any of the arrest locations on June 3rd. An Interpol red notice has been issued. No extradition treaty with the UAE covers ITAR violations under the current bilateral framework. The network is dismantled. The components that reach their buyers are in the field. And the gap in the compliance architecture that made the substitution scheme invisible for 17 months has been closed in this iteration. The demand that created the network still exists. If you followed this case from the early reporting, or if you've dealt with export control compliance issues yourself, drop a comment. We read every one. This is Case Zero. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.